Hi, my name is Brooke Gabers, and we are Group 3 presenting on Chapter 4 about national security and school safety. I am currently working with Nebraska MTSS, and I am the Region 3 support lead, so I serve districts in ESUs 1, 7, and 8.
And my name is Megan Vanosic, and I currently work at Lexington Public Schools as an instructional coach.
My name is Brandy Zavadil, and I am currently at Schuyler Community Schools, also as an instructional coach and EL counselor.
My name is Austin Lenhoff. I currently work at Omaha Nations Public School, and I'm in the alternative education program.
All right. So just to get started with a brief overview, after the tragic events of 9/11, national security and school safety have been a government priority, which includes school safety, as there have been a significant rise in violence striking public schools. As a result, many measures have been initiated by school officials to respond to national threats to the safety of students, faculty, and staff. This has had a significant impact in the operation of schools. Maintaining school safety is of the utmost importance and concern, as our public schools are presumed to be safe places. So ensuring that school safety does require that there are policy implications and changes that have to be made by school leaders. So many schools actually partner and collaborate with their local law enforcement agencies to address issues involving safety. School officials should develop contingency plans, simulate them, and implement them as the need arises to address, anticipate, or foresee events that may threaten school safety. Schools are also expected to incorporate responses to natural disasters like hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes in their plans as well. The goal of these plans is to be proactive rather than reactive. So then we have the Patriot Act, which was enacted after 9/11. It was intended to address potential terrorist threats, authorizing U.S. law authorities to investigate and preempt potential terrorist acts in the United States and around the world. Public schools do fall under the jurisdiction of this act in the sense that school leaders are required to produce books, records, paper documents, or other items for an authorized investigation to protect against terrorism. So with that, the FBI can obtain a court order without probable cause from a secret court for the production of these items, which could also include internet usage and email addresses. It's important to note that the definition of terrorism is an activity that results in coercion or intimidation involving the government and American citizens and can involve violation of criminal law as well as endangerment of human life. FERPA, or the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, permits educational agencies and institutions to disclose without consent or knowledge of the student or parent any records that may be connected to an investigation or terrorism crimes. There is a lot of ongoing controversy around the government's expanded powers under the US Patriot Act. And then we also have the No Child Left Behind Act. And while it's most commonly recognized for its focus on attempting to close achievement gaps in academic performance, the No Child Left Behind Act has also put an emphasis on school safety. Under this act, schools must provide assurances that plans are on file regarding steps schools will initiate to maintain safe and drug-free environments. The National School Safety Center also has developed some guidelines to enhance safety, like identifying the context in which learning will take place within the school's mission statement. So for example, it might say, as a part of it, it might say something like to learn in a safe and secure environment. Some other guidelines that they have are identifying a specific procedure for evaluating and responding to threats, identifying potential disasters that could occur based on the school's setting and climate, controlling campus access, identifying specifically assigned roles and responsibilities when it comes to security, identifying whom to call in a crisis, providing cultural awareness and sensitivity training, establishing an emergency operation communication system, and implementing a uniform school crime reporting and record keeping system.
Okay, I'm up with handling violence in schools. So you can go ahead and put the slide up. So the slide just states that with the presence of gangs in schools, school leaders are encountering pressures from parents, citizens, and school boards to provide a safe environment where teachers can teach and students can learn. So the premise behind violence within schools is really just recognizing that that is everybody's responsibility who is working within a school and within a district. It's really the district's responsibility to set the expectations out beforehand so that everyone can be on the same page with what the rules are, what their expectations are, and kind of that preventative measure in looking at school violence. And it's really an all hands on deck approach. So regardless of who you are, if you're stepping foot in a school, you are responsible for the expectations of violence within schools. And so in order for a district to do that, they obviously need to put that out beforehand, before the school year starts, and really just stick to those expectations and make sure that they're enforcing them with the consequences. Added to these pressures is the view of the courts that schools are safe places based on the assumption that children are supervised by licensed and well-trained teachers and administrators. And the book really goes into the fact that when violence within a school happens, a lot of the first steps come down to what were the preventative measures that the school took in order for this to be prevented. Oftentimes when violence occurs, it's not just an impulse act. It's usually premeditated, or it has been building for some time with just red flags here and there. And so when violence gets to that level where it occurs and there may be charges with it, the first thing they're going to look at is really what were the expectations, who was trained in the expectations, what kind of PD was laid out for everybody, and then what measures were taken leading up to the violence that occurred. Next topic is bullying. And obviously bullying is kind of a hot topic in schools, has been for quite a while. So bullying is associated with many acts of violence in public schools. And I would say that that's probably the case for all schools, not necessarily just public schools. Bullying generally involves intentional cruel behavior between the person who exhibits this behavior and the same students who are victims of bullying behavior. And so that's kind of just stating that oftentimes a bully has repetitive behaviors of bullying students who are kind of at risk for being bullied. And then the victims are oftentimes students who are bullied multiple times. Violence occurs in bullying between the bully to the victim, but it also can occur in retaliation back to the bully. And so a lot of times the victims, get bullied so much that they oftentimes strike back, and usually it's in a violent behavior. Sometimes that can even occur through self-harm and things like that. And so it can just be a really negative cycle that happens that leads back to the violence within schools. There's often a pattern of repeated antisocial behavior toward others, but bullying may also involve a single incident. So just historically speaking, when someone's bullied, it's often happened before, not usually just a one-time thing, but obviously there's exceptions to the rules. So it could happen just one time. A bully, depending on the circumstances, may be charged criminally if he or she exceeds the age of 12. And so at that point, kind of going back to the violence, and when violence occurs and it gets to the point of going to the courts, the same thing happens with a bully situation. And so if someone's bullied and that situation becomes so detrimental that someone's going to be charged with it, the first thing that they're going to look at is kind of that buildup of what happened. So what expectations were in place, what anti-bullying policies were in place, who was trained on these policies, and then what preventative measures were taken for that. One thing the book stated is that having an anti-bullying policy in place is almost mandatory in this day and age. It helps minimize the bullying and it helps create that safe school environment. The other thing the book mentioned is that the school is responsible for training everyone involved. And so whoever is going to be in contact with any students, they need to be trained in anti-bullying policies and consequences. And so not just your teachers and your principals, your lunch ladies, your custodians, your bus drivers, all of those people need to be trained in those policies as well. On to cyberbullying. So cyberbullying involves the use of electronic devices to post hurtful, embarrassing text or images intended to create anxiety, intimidation, or emotional distress in another person. I'm sure we can all agree that we have seen quite the increase in cyberbullying with the increase in the use of technology. So really the same rules apply with cyberbullying as it does with bullying. That there's a pattern that's occurring. Cyberbullying, I think, can be kind of a tricky topic, kind of a gray area for schools, because a lot of times that happens not within the school time or on school, like within the school building. But it still kind of falls back onto the school to have the same policies in place. So just like you will have your anti-bullying policies, you have your anti-cyberbullying policies in place. So I would say the most critical part of that is just making sure that you have your guidelines laid out of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what will the school be responsible for dealing with as far as cyberbullying, and what would lay more on the parents as far as that goes. And so I think just the most important part again is being able to provide the preventative measures in order to help kiddos not encounter the cyberbullying. More serious forms of communication may involve hate speech, threats, sexually offensive content, or messages designed to ridicule the victim. And so that's just going into more detail about, cyberbullying isn't just sending a message about how you don't like someone. It's gotten to the point where people are, using technology to really hurt people, and it's causing a lot of issues. And so it's important again for the school to lay out what the expectations are, especially with school devices. I think that comes into play a lot here with one-to-one, devices now in a lot of schools. And then, what levels of consequences are going to happen depending on the level of bullying that's happening. So a consistent pattern of these types of communication on the internet constitutes cyberbullying. So just reiterating that, it can happen via internet, it can happen, in person. It's just kind of that pattern that kind of constitutes that bullying and cyberbullying. And now onto the Megan Meier case. So there was a Megan Meier Cyberbullying Preventative Act that was presented after a young gal named Megan Meier committed suicide when a classmate and her mother fabricated an online account attributed to a fictitious 16-year-old boy to whom Megan was attracted. And so this, when you think about cyberbullying, this really goes all the way up to that really harmful level. You would think that this would be on the side of one of the more worst things you could do as a cyberbully. And so unfortunately, this led to someone taking their own life because it was so distraughtful for them. And so after this occurred and it kind of came out what was happening, Megan Meier's family went and put an act together and presented it to be passed into law. And I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, there you go. So after she committed suicide, the Cyberbullying Prevention Act was introduced to Congress. And I think there's one more. Yep. So the intent of the act was to amend the federal criminal code to impose criminal penalties on anyone who transmits in interstate or foreign commerce a communication intended to coerce, intimidate, harass, or cause substantial emotional distress to another person using electronic means to support severe, repeated, and hostile behavior. So in a nutshell, someone can be criminally charged for cyberbullying. And that was introduced to Congress. I know in the reading it said that when the book was wrote that it was still waiting, pending approval. I did look it up to see if it had been approved, and last I knew it had not. So it had actually been denied and not passed into law. And so I think it's important just looking at it from a school perspective, again, having all your ducks in a row. So if this is something that's happening on your campus and they come back and you have this court case happening, what documentation, what steps have you taken as a district to prevent these kind of things? And then, if the bullying had been reported, what steps have you taken further to help the victim? So I think that wraps it up for me.
Awesome. Okay, so I had gang characteristics and that kind of thing. So just a quick overview. Gang activity had actually declined in the mid 1990s through about 2005 in the United States. But currently, according to the text, there had been an increase in gangs and gang activity since then. The text is 10 years old, but based on what we're seeing in schools, gang activity is continuing to rise. But just due to the increase in gang activity, schools need to be aware of potential violence that may occur within their building. So a failure to be proactive in foreseeing possible violence or issues with gangs could actually lead to liability claims being filed against the schools. Schools are responsible for taking reasonable measures to prevent foreseeable injury. And we'll talk about more about what foreseeable injury is later on. So basically schools do this by monitoring gang behavior in school and responding quickly to any kind of intel that suggests that gang activity is present so that they can mediate problems before they become more violent. So gang characteristics, gangs are best described as a group of individuals involved in unusually close social relationships. They often identify with a gang with a name or symbols, signs, and often are proclaiming or owning a specific area or turf, if they like to call it, or part of town. The reason that, sorry, I'm gonna keep talking about characteristics for a minute. The reason that it is especially nerve-wracking for their presence in schools is because a lot of times gangs are involved in criminal activities such as selling drugs or weapons or using both. And so with the presence of gangs in schools creates fear among students and among staff. And so it's important to be aware of those situations. Gang members are often young teenage males with similar ethnic or racial backgrounds. Loyalty and camaraderie is often strengthened through illegal and violent activities. There's a chain of command normally that they adhere to. Normally the most veteran person is on top, and then they recruit younger members. Actually, in recent years, they have evidence that they are recruiting members as young as 8 or 9-year-old males, along with females. A lot of times these students or these kids feel like they feel neglected, they feel a need for acceptance or something like that. Sometimes they need an economic reward, and so they will join gangs. Also disturbing, many times gang members are initiated by committing a violent act, and so that activity leaks into schools. School administration play a vital role in keeping students safe with the presence of gangs. There is a graphic on page 116 that suggests a rise of gang problems in schools and in the communities in general. Okay, sorry.
Sorry, I was really quick happy there.
No, that's okay. So gang members often tend to wear similar apparel to unify themselves and to show that they are part of the gang. So where gang activity has been identified and there's a clear knowledge of certain types of dresses of associations, school officials can actually prohibit that type of dress. However, this needs to be done through the formal process of creating a policy and having board pass the policy and put it into handbooks and those kinds of things. Gangs have actually caught on to this type of pattern, and so they change their appearance frequently to become a little bit less recognizable. So current gang members are wearing professional team jackets, caps, and t-shirts, which is common for all students to wear, and so it's difficult to identify and create policies to prevent that kind of apparel because that's what everybody is wearing. So it's hard to differentiate who's part of the gang and who's not. But schools can still take reasonable steps to minimize the gang presence in schools. And then next, duty of care and gang violence. So again, based on foreseeability, school personnel are expected to exercise a standard of care that's actually a little bit more intense than under similar circumstances. If school officials are aware of gang presence, there's a greater expectation of monitoring the gang behavior, and the standard of care has to be higher when known gang activity is occurring. The courts expect evidence of behavior that conforms to the standard that a reasonable, mature, and intelligent person would meet in relation to the seriousness of the situation. So just like when we were talking about bullying, there has to be documentation and evidence that everybody in the school had been trained and that proper procedures were followed in order to prevent the violence. If there's not adequate evidence, there may be liability charges filed. And then the other thing that the book talked about was that limiting gang violence isn't the sole responsibility of the school. So the school's role surrounds creating a safe environment for, like we said before, teachers to teach and students to learn. The school is responsible for, removing graffiti, keeping those clothes out of schools, but also maintaining a close working relationship with law enforcement agencies to help identify kids and issues that may arise. And so actually in our district, we work really closely with law enforcement for these types of issues. And also school leaders are expected to be proactive instead of reactive when handling gangs, just due to the increase in firearms in gangs and gang members, and just more violent behavior than in the past. So again, school leaders are responsible for creating and maintaining an environment where effective teaching and learning can occur. And then on page 117, there is a graphic for an administrative guide to gang violence, but I don't think we need to go through all of those.
Okay, so we got school uniform dress policies, school safety, and students' freedom of expression rights. So in being in high school especially, teachers deal with this and administration deals with this all the time. You kind of have to find that balance between freedom of expression or just if students are getting distracted, safety, and kind of items like that. Many school officials, in their desire to create and maintain safe schools, have developed uniform dress code policies for students. As school uniform policies are drawn by school leaders, it's prudent that they be mindful of the freedom of expression rights for students. And we, in the book, it talks about this as well. As long as a school, you come up with a good policy and you follow that policy, and the students usually agree upon that when they enter your school districts and they understand that responsibility for themselves. and it usually goes on well, but dress sometimes falls into that zero tolerance category, which I'll talk about later, in which the book talked quite a bit about. Policies that do not recognize these rights are risky at best and may result in legal challenges and unnecessary legal costs for school districts. So going into the drug testing, this goes into zero tolerance as well. Schools tend to have that idea in the back of their mind that if you break this rule, there's going to be severe consequences. And that's usually part of their bylaws and what they go by as a school district. And this also goes in effect if probable cause when being searched. That's a big thing, especially with schools and resource officers being used. But until the 1990s, no case involving drug testing. Public schools had been liquidated by the U.S. Supreme Court. Verona School District in Acton versus Acton, however, reached the Supreme Court when the North Circuit Court reversed the district court holding for the school district. Under the district's policy, all student athletes are required to provide a urine sample at the beginning of the season for a particular sport in which they participated. Alcohol and breathalyzer testing. School officials may, based on school or district policy, administrative breathalyzer testing where there are immediate concern regarding students under the influence of alcohol during voluntary school sponsored events. I've actually seen this. Again, this is part of probable cause, and schools have the right to remove students that they believe are either smoking marijuana or drinking alcohol or some kind of drug, or if they're under the influence, and they have the right to remove students or actually have them go to a breathalyzer or an alcohol test, especially willing from the families when that comes up. Again, that's part of zero tolerance policies. School officials will likely succeed initiating a breathalyzer test to any student if they have reasonable suspicion that the student is under the influence of alcohol. Again, this falls into probable cause for a school district. It gets a little murky more when you deal with the resource officers. A responsible suspicion may be established if school officials detect the smell of alcohol on a student or observe behavior that might suggest a student is intoxicated, such as slurred speech or impaired motor control.
All right, I think that is it for chapter 4, unless anybody else has something you want to add in. All right.